Last April, I gave a lecture on the 150th anniversary of the birth of Impressionism, and today I'll continue the story with an emphasis on its most famous painter. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Leigh Cohn, and I've loved and studied Monet ever since I was a youngster. I've learned from him as an oil painter and have a personal connection to his artwork from visits to the Art Institute of Chicago as a child and having a relative who collected Impressionist art. As I pointed out in our previous lecture, we learned that Monet came to Paris in 1858 to become a painter. He was 18 years old from the Normandy coast and had been selling caricatures since his mid-teens. As you can see, they were signed Oscar. But once he started painting, he signed as Claude Monet. In any case, he was always just Monet, even among friends and family. Over the next 15 years, he became friends with a group of contemporaries that revolted against the salon standards. They painted plein air, outdoors in nature, taking advantage of new technology like portable tubes of paint and broader railway service, and their pictures appealed to the younger, upwardly mobile middle class. In 1874, this group formed an anonymous society to put on an art exhibition of their work. Although there were 30 painters in that first Impressionist exhibition, these 7 painters formed the core group, and they would become known as the Impressionists. That moniker came about from a derisive art review of the first exhibition that used the name of Monet's Impression Sunrise. The critic ridiculed the painting as being nothing more than a sketch or impression, not a finished painting. The first Impressionist exhibition opened on April 15, 1874, and was a critical and commercial debacle. Afterwards, the artists took their meager earnings and scattered. Camille Pissarro returned to his wife and children in the country. Berthe Morisot went on her honeymoon with Manet's brother Eugene. Degas, a native Parisian from a well-to-do family, continued painting the ballet dancers he'd been obsessed over for a number of years. And Monet returned to Argenteuil, a popular setting for artists and writers on the Seine. Monet loved gardening with the same passion as he had for painting. Here he is with his wife Camille and their son Jean in a painting by Edouard Manet. But don't confuse the two men. Last time I spoke about Manet in depth, his outrageous personality, his friendship and influence on the Impressionist painters, but refusal to display paintings at their exhibition, and his salacious affair with Berthe Morisot, the only woman in the original group. As I explained last time, Manet was driven to be critically accepted, but it was impulsivity and roguishness that led to his fame, or infamy. He was one of the biggest celebrities in Paris, but he was unsuccessful critically and commercially during his lifetime. That's Manet with an A. On the other hand, Monet with an O was the most successful of the Impressionists and was pretty much loved and respected by everyone, with the exception of those early critics. We'll return to him soon. Inarguably, the most significant person in the rise of Impressionism was the art dealer Paul Durand-Ruel. He was the first dealer to recognize their potential. During his career, he bought more than 5,000 Impressionist pictures, including about 400 paintings by Alfred Sisley, 800 by Pissarro, 1,000 by Monet, about 400 by Degas, and more than 1,500 by Auguste Renoir, including more than 100 that are now in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Although Durand-Ruel somewhat supported Cezanne, the initially shy and clumsy painter who had bouts of depression, paranoia, and extreme insecurity, it was Pissarro's emotional support and artistic mentorship that was most significant to Cezanne's growth. However, a big boon to Cezanne's confidence came when he sold this picture at the first Impressionist exhibition. It was one of the few paintings that were sold, and he earned a respectable 300 francs. So, 300 francs is our starting point, and from here, painting prices get higher as the lecture continues. Cezanne also benefited around that time when he met Victor Choquet, who collected and commissioned many of Cezanne's paintings. In the meantime, Renoir had an idea to hold an auction at the Hotel Drouot. Monet quickly agreed to participate, as did Sisley, Degas, and Morisot. Manet, as usual, refused to include his own paintings, but he helped the event by getting a celebrated critic, Albert Wolff, to write a preview in Le Figaro. Wolff made a mockery of the pictures, writing, "The impression the Impressionists create is that of a cat walking across the keys of a piano or a monkey with a box of paints." Of course, this brought in crowds of people anxious to see the disastrous show. When Morisot's first painting was raised, someone cried out, "Whore!" and Pissarro, who wasn't even exhibiting, punched the guy in the face. Nonetheless, Morisot's interiors sold for the highest bid of 480 francs. Overall, the sale was successful, especially in that new collectors developed relationships with the artists. This is where Monet's Impression Sunrise found a buyer. He was Ernest Hochet. Remember that name, Hochet. Another buyer, Georges Carpentier, bought a Renoir and was so taken by him that he invited the artist to come to his home and meet his young wife, Marguerite. They were a wealthy, popular couple and befriended Renoir, buying his paintings and introducing him to their peers. She regularly invited him to soirees with celebrated figures of the day, which led to more connections and commissions. One of the regular guests was Jean Saint-Marais, a vivacious and beautiful 18-year-old. She lived with her parents, who requested that Renoir paint her portrait in their home. This led to more paintings, away from their home, and the results show his admiration for Jean. You can recognize Jean in at least 6 of the faces that are most prominently featured here at Le Moulin de la Galette. I don't think she and Renoir were lovers, but she did say that Renoir was not the marrying kind. He marries all the women he paints, but only with his brush. He was charming and could convince the mothers of young women that he was trustworthy, but eventually they willingly posed in the nude. But let's get back to Renoir's friend and former roommate, Monet. Everyone assumed that Monet was striking it rich, but he too was re-entering a state of poverty. He gave up on his goal of settling down in the upscale Argenteuil because he could no longer afford the rent. This is where Ernest Hochet returns to the story. By 1875, Hochet was running a large textile business he had inherited from his parents. However, he was a bungling businessman, and the company was in crisis. His wife, Elise, came from an even wealthier and more prominent family. Hochet invited Monet to paint 4 large-scale pictures to decorate the walls of their palatial Château de Rothenburg near Paris, and gave him a cottage on the grounds for a studio. You can see the chateau in the upper right of Turkey's, which was one of the commissions. These were large canvases, roughly 6 feet squared. However, this lovely picture was never delivered. Hochet had been obsessively buying paintings like an addict, and in the process he drove his company to ruin and household into debt. By June 1878, Ernest's creditors caught up with him. He declared bankruptcy and auctioned off more than 100 paintings, driving art prices down in a volatile market. He was also sentenced to a month in prison. By this time, Monet's family rented a small house in Vautuille, which was a bit further from Paris and less nouveau riche than Argenteuil. Remember, Camille Dancieux was his first great love. She became his favorite model and lover in 1865, and they'd married 5 years later. She's in this early masterpiece a few times. They'd been together in squalor and success. Now he was back to being a struggling artist supporting a family of 4, plus she was ill. Although Monet was extremely annoyed with Ernest for not paying him and for causing the whole art market to crash, he still allowed Hochet to move his family, including a cook, into the small house in Vautuille. Granted, Ernest spent most of his time in Paris or otherwise traveling, but the Monets were left with Elise Hochet and her 6 children. There were advantages. Monet had potential models in the house, But most importantly, Elise and her older daughters helped nurse Camille, who liked to rest on a chaise in the garden and stroke the Hochaday sisters' hair. After saying goodbye to her sons, Camille died on September 5th, 1879, with Monet at her bedside. Elise and her daughters laid out Camille's body and sat vigil for 2 days. In a letter, Elise wrote that her death was long and horrible. Monet quickly painted her and later described what had come over him. Watching her tragic forehead, almost mechanically observing in the colors which death was imposing on her rigid face, blue, yellow, gray, what do I know? How natural it to want to reproduce the last image of her, who was leaving forever. I just seemed to be compelled in an unconscious activity, the one I engage in every day, like an animal turning in its mill. In his misery, the despondent Monet spent months grieving. He rarely painted, and then only still life subjects. But let me back up to the 1875 auction to introduce another important figure. Gustave Caillebotte was attending that day not as a painter, but as a patron. He came from an upper-class Parisian family with a fortune in textiles. This is his family home. He was well educated with a law degree, and he also studied engineering. But with an enormous inheritance, he could pretty much do whatever he wished. And he wished to be a painter, so his parents let him have an art studio in their home. He briefly studied, but seemed to quickly develop his own unique style. Caillebotte had virtually unlimited wealth and was an eager buyer at the sale. He went on to be a great supporter of his painter friends and a prodigious collector of their works. Unlike the other Impressionist painters, he could afford to paint without having to sell his paintings. He also had unique methods that included photography, extensive sketching, and architectural drawings to achieve exacting perspective. He also used a grid. Does this look familiar? This wonderful painting is in the Art Institute of Chicago. It's 7 feet high and 9 feet wide, and the couple in the foreground are nearly life-size. In 1875, Caillebotte underwrote the Second Impressionist exhibition, in which he had 8 pictures displayed. It was held at the Durand-Ruel's gallery, and this painting was the sensation of the show, both appreciated and scorned as vulgar for its portrayal of bare-chested laborers. Although he was younger than the other Impressionists, Caillebotte died early, at the age of 45, having pretty much abandoned his fling with painting and devoting his attentions to yachting and gardening. Nonetheless, upon death, his estate held more than 68 Impressionist masterpieces, which he bequeathed to the French government under Renoir's direction as executor. An additional 40 of his own works are in the Musée d'Orsay. The third Impressionist exhibition was held in 1877, and it was the first time that the group used the term Impressionists to describe themselves. Again, Caillebotte financed the exhibit, which created a rivalry with Degas, who wanted more control. Degas also squabbled with Monet about whose paintings should be included. His Gare Saint-Lazare canvases stood out at the show and were highly praised by many of the critics. This was a familiar setting for most Parisians that had never before been seen as the source of artistic landscape. 2 years later, the fourth Impressionist exhibition was held, and it was more successful than the earlier shows. Impressionism had finally caught on. The reviews were positive, and the crowds bought so many pictures that there were profits for every artist. Again, Caillebotte and Degas were the central organizers, but things were changing in the group. Monet didn't participate because he was too upset over his wife's death, but he had other reasons as well. He, Renoir, Sisley, and Cezanne all declined to send painting. Instead, Degas invited several new painters to exhibit, and one of them was the breakout star of the show. She was an American, Marie Cassatt, who had sought out Degas after seeing one of his paintings in Durand-Ruel's gallery. They quickly became collaborators, sharing affluent backgrounds and tastes in art and literature. During an erratic friendship that lasted for 30 years, he introduced her to pastel, printmaking, and engraving. Cassatt was an extraordinary painter whose style was reminiscent of Renoir's. She was born into a large upper-middle-class family in Pennsylvania in 1844. When she was 6 years old, her family embarked on an extensive tour of Europe, spending a long period in Paris, where she studied French at the age of 11. She visited the Salon and saw the works by French Romantic artists like Eugène Delacroix, and attended a solo exhibition of Gustave Courbet. These were the same painters who were influencing the young painters who would become the Impressionists. However, just as Mary's interest was peaking, her family returned to America. By the age of 16, she had decided on a career in art and enrolled in drawing classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. The program was rigorously regimented, and she felt frustrated and left after 2 years. In the same way that Monet and his friends broke away from their French academic studios, Cassatt was independent-minded and wanted to chart her own course, which led her back to Paris in 1865 after the U.S. Civil War ended. Chaperoned, of course. In 1868, she had this painting accepted by the Salon, the same thing Monet, Renoir, and the others were striving for at that same time. Her work was accepted the following year as well, but she again had to return to America when the Franco-Prussian War began in 1870. Cassatt tried to pursue her art in the States, but things didn't go well. Her parents refused to pay for her materials unless she could sell her paintings. When she brought many of her pictures to exhibit in Chicago, they were all destroyed in the Great Fire of 1871, and she felt totally defeated. However, her luck soon changed when she received a commission to copy an Italian fresco with travel expenses included. Whether she ever actually did the painting is unknown, but this led her back to Paris, where she took up residence for some 50-plus years. She knew all the other painters, bought a few of Monet's, and had a cordial relationship with the aloof Morisot, but she is most closely associated with Degas. They were off and on friends from the day they met, and during one pause in their friendship, Degas saw this picture at Durand-Ruel's and raced to Mary's home. He described it in detail, praising that it was the greatest picture of the century. Then, as she explained to an interviewer much later, Degas said, "It has all of your qualities and all of your faults." He called it Jesus with an American nanny. As I've said before, Degas was often obnoxious and repugnant. Okay, backing up again. Cassatt was the breakout star of the Fourth Impressionist exhibition in 1879. The fifth and sixth exhibitions were underwhelming, again because Monet and others from the core group didn't participate. Instead of exhibiting, Renoir was busy with many commissions and other compositions. In 1880, Renoir found a new muse in Hélène Victorine Carregaud, a 20 years younger dressmaker who you can see repeatedly in this painting at La Galette. Renoir and Hélène were definitely lovers and married in 1890. They had 3 children, 2 of whom became famous in their own right, Pierre as a painter and Jean as a legendary filmmaker. Renoir's final great muse came to help out when Hélène was pregnant with Jean in 1894. Gabrielle was Hélène's 15-year-old cousin, had an education from nuns, and had never been outside of her small village. She became part of their household and served as a nanny for Jean, housekeeper, and model for Renoir, who painted her more than 200 times. Hélène and Auguste were together for 35 years, and she lovingly cared for him until her death, at which time Gabrielle remained in the house and looked after Renoir, while he suffered from rheumatoid arthritis. You can see how gnarled his fingers had become, and Gabrielle and other helpers would set up his palette and easel and bandage the paintbrush to his hand. Here Gabrielle is at 22 years old, and according to Jean, she was at ease posing in the nude. As an aside, she was fascinated by early silent films and took Jean to see his first film when he was a few years old. Jean Renoir went on to become one of the most influential filmmakers in the history of cinema. Let's round out the exhibitions. The seventh was held in 1882, and again Degas was fighting with the other core painters. Durand-Ruel wanted the show to be exclusive to Impressionism, thus excluding some of the newcomers that Degas enlisted. Ultimately, Monet, Renoir, Sisley, Morisot, and Pissarro exhibited, as well as Caillebotte and Paul Gauguin. Degas refused to join in, and Cassatt stayed away out of loyalty to her friend. Finally, the eighth was held in 1886 and is noteworthy primarily because it was the last. For some people, this signals the end of the Age of Impressionism. But actually, it was just breaking out. A seminal event in the history of art occurred in 1886 when Paul Durand-Ruel introduced Impressionism to New York. He brought 300 paintings to sell from 6 of the 7 original group members. Cezanne was not included, but Monet was. There was also a gallery devoted to the young pointillists, a new offshoot of Impressionism, and Paul Gauguin, who was at the forefront of what became known as post-Impressionism. When the ship arrived, there were 43 cases facing high tariffs, plus Durand-Ruel was afraid that the nudes by Renoir might be rejected. So following the advice of the chief customs officer, Durand-Ruel made a sizable donation to a Catholic church, and the whole lot was allowed entry for free as temporary imports. However, those paintings never went back to France. Held for 3 weeks in enormous galleries of the American Art Association off Madison Avenue, most critics praised the artwork, and the attendees were awestruck by a style of painting that was being seen for the first time in the United States. Unsurprisingly, Monet received the most attention, and his 48 paintings were the most by any of the artists. Sales were generally good, but not great. But Durand-Ruel held more sales, smaller exhibits, and then opened his own gallery in New York, the first of 2. Impressionism was here to stay, and Durand-Ruel had made his fortune. So finally, let me tell you the rest of Monet's story, and it's not short. When we left off in 1879, his wife Camille had died. Monet was despondent, and the Hochedets were living with the Monets in a small house in Vautuille. Once he was ready to return to painting, he started with some still lives, local winter scenes, and meditative landscapes. He also traveled for stretches away from home, starting with a trip to the Normandy coast, where he grew up. In these years, Monet not only had great success at the 7th Impressionist exhibition in 1882, but the following year, Durand-Ruel held a solo exhibit for Monet, a first for any of the Impressionists. As Monet's finances improved, the household moved to a rental in Giverny, a village of 279 inhabitants on the Seine, less than an hour north of Paris by train. They were in the countryside, about 3 miles from the slightly larger town of Vernon. He was 43 years old and at the midpoint of his life. To escape the chaos of the full house in Giverny, he also traveled to Bordighera, which was about a 24-hour train ride from Paris on the Mediterranean coast, just across the Italian border. First, he went with Renoir, then by himself, doing about 30 more paintings. After some touch-up in the studio back home, Monet bickered with Durand-Ruel, ultimately receiving 18,200 francs for 22 of the pictures. Although Alice Hochedet was still legally married to Ernst, who was no longer part of the equation, she and Monet were a couple. Alice was from a wealthy family when she married Ernest, and her dowry kept them going as he lost his own family's fortune. Although her early relationship with Monet was vaguely scandalous, her aristocratic background brought respectability to their household. She was bright, well-organized, kept the house running smoothly, and supported Monet's genius with an open heart. With their 8 children, they were a united family. After being together for 14 years, Ernest died and Monet and Alice married, primarily for social reasons. Although Monet was not interested in religion, Elise was, and she felt it appropriate that they be married at least a few days before her daughter Cezanne tied the knot with an American painter, Theodore Earl Butler. A few years later, Cezanne died, leaving 2 children, and Butler married her sister Martha. While we're here, I'll point out that Jean Monet, near the center, and his stepsister Blanche, sitting noticeably apart, they married each other more than a decade later in 1897. The beautiful Cezanne was Monet's favorite model, and he complained about it when she left home to marry Butler. However, most of them served as models for Monet, and they brought life to his landscapes just as Camille had back in Argenteuil. The boys also modeled. Jean-Pierre was less than a year older than Michel, and they were great buddies. Jean-Pierre would have been conceived around the time that Monet was painting at the Hochedé Chateau, and there are rumors that he, and not Ernst, was the boy's father. Of the 8 children, only Blanche showed an interest in painting. She served as his assistant and also became an accomplished painter in her own right. As a matter of fact, one of her paintings went up for auction earlier this month at Christie's and sold for about $20,000. I've been jumping back and forth, so let's pick up the story in 1889, when Monet had a private exhibition organized by the art dealer Theo van Gogh, who was Vincent's brother. Monet received about 20,000 francs for 10 seascapes of Antibes on the French Riviera. That same year, Monet and Auguste Rodin also had a combined exhibit at the Galerie Georges Petit in 1889. Rodin was already being compared to Michelangelo and is widely considered as the first modern sculptor. He's often grouped with the Impressionists because he was a revolutionary Parisian artist during the same time period. Coincidentally, Rodin was born just 2 days earlier than Monet. They were not fast friends, but instead had a bit of a rivalry. They were undoubtedly 2 of the most famous artists in Paris. At the exhibit, Monet was displaying 150 paintings, including this old picture of Camille that had escaped Alice's purge of mementos of their life together. He painstakingly made decisions about the placement of the pictures, while Rodin refused to be bothered. However, on the morning of the opening, Monet arrived to see that Rodin had rearranged his sculptures, blocking the sightlines of his paintings. Monet complained to Georges Petit and then retreated back to Giverny. Told that Monet was upset, Rodin angrily replied to friends, "I don't give a damn about Monet. I don't give a damn about anyone. The only thing I'm worried about is me." Nonetheless, Rodin credited Monet for helping him to understand light, and he also visited Monet's home. But Rodin was a misogynist and a womanizer, and he's rumored to have lusted after Monet's stepdaughters, which would have definitely not been welcomed. These were prosperous times for Monet, and the art dealers were competing for his pictures. In some cases, Monet pitted them against one another or held back his best paintings to drive prices higher. In 1890, helped by an advance from Durand-Ruel, Monet bought the house and 2.5 acres of land that they'd been renting in Giverny for the past 7 years. It cost 22,000 francs. The next year, Monet earned 97,000 francs from painting sales. So Monet's days of eating rice or beans and skipping out on the rent were far behind him. Giverny is a small village in the countryside and was mainly farmland. It takes less than an hour to get there from Paris by train. The house is long and thin with 2 stories. It's open to the public and has been maintained to look just as it had when Monet lived there. This is the dining room leading into the kitchen. On the wall you can see a few of the Japanese prints that he collected. Here he is in his first studio, which became a mini gallery and sitting room where he could entertain visitors. Monet loved gardening as much as painting, and he was the estate's landscape designer. He spent a fortune on the 2.5 acres planting flowers and trees. Plus he built greenhouses, service buildings, and a cottage for the head gardener, who led a staff of up to 8 workers. In 1893, Monet bought a parcel of marshland across the train tracks, nearly doubling the acreage. It was bordered by the Rue, a stream coming off the Epte River. Despite protests by local villagers downstream, he was given permission to divert the stream and create a pond about the length of a football field. Here's a photo I took of the Lily Pond in 2012, and this is a painting I finished this year that's about 5 feet wide. The 90s were a period of great success for Monet. He introduced the concept of serial paintings, returning to the same subject matter over and over. In May 1891, Durand-Ruel's gallery opened a show with 15 haystack paintings, all of which were sold by the end of the year. They started at about 1,000 francs per painting, but steadily increased, and Pissarro, who also had paintings in the exhibit, wrote to his son, "People want nothing but Monets. Worst of all, they want Milou at prices of 4, 5, and 6,000 francs. In 2019, this one sold for $110 million, breaking the record for Impressionist work of art. Monet probably would have complained that the price wasn't high enough. Monet next moved on to a line of poplar trees less than 2 kilometers away by boat from which he painted. He was mid-series when they went up for auction by the village, and he petitioned the mayor to hold off on the sale, but was refused. Finally, Monet made an agreement to pay a timber merchant extra money over the top bid to buy and delay the cutting of the trees, complaining, "And so it turned out my wallet felt the damage." The winning bid was less than 6,000 francs, probably worth the going rate for one of the 22 paintings he produced for this series. From the time Monet moved to Giverny in 1883, other painters from around the world went there with hopes of studying with him. Many came from the United States, including his neighbor Lila Perry and her husband, who showed up every summer. She described their deep friendship, how Monet painted layers in sessions, his artistic conscientiousness, and how she once came upon him sticking his foot through a canvas in frustration. Monet approved of another young American, Theodore Earle Butler, and allowed him to marry his stepdaughter Cezanne, as I mentioned. However, he worried to Elise that their new son-in-law wouldn't be able to make a living as a painter. However, Monet mainly refused to have anything to do with most of the growing art colony. One, John Leslie Breck, wanted to propose to Blanche, and Monet sent him packing. I don't know how many more haystack imitators he could take. For his Rouen Cathedral series, he worked unreasonably hard, on 10 or 12 of them at a time, shifting between them depending on the light. Sometimes, by the time he found the right canvas and got it up on the easel, the light had changed once again. He worked on each painting several times, both in Rouen and back in Giverny, but the early part of the process was particularly tortuous. He wrote, "I shall never manage anything good." Monet could be violently critical about his artwork, prone to fits of depression, demanding about getting his needs met, and brutally shrewd in business dealings. But he loved his family and was loyal to his friends. He could be altruistic, entertaining, and gracious, but his impossibly high artistic standard caused him to destroy hundreds of paintings. Elise lamented that he had black moods and that he punctures canvases every day. The daughter of another painter wrote a long description of him that I'll excerpt. She said, "He had a clear, ringing voice and a natural, direct way of speaking that inspired confidence. Although he gave the impression at first sight of being rather peasant-like, this vanished as soon as he began to speak. One quickly realized just how refined his mind was." Monet liked good living, a morning drink of chocolate, only small doses of water, and good wine. He smoked about 40 cigarettes a day, mostly in the open air, and he threw them away half-smoked. He also collected cars, and by 1905 had a fleet worth 40,000 francs. When he received the town's first speeding ticket, the village published a notice that autos may not go any faster than the speed of a horse at a regular trot. His Morning on the Seine series gives a good example of his personality. He wanted to capture a fleeting moment of light and reflection, which was particularly demanding because he had to wake up at 4 in the morning in order to arrive at the same location and begin painting on one of his 3 boats. He brought along numerous partially worked upon canvases, desperate to match one of them to the current day's sunrise. This, of course, was virtually impossible. During one moment of rage, he flung his paint box in the water. Sometimes he became so upset that he checked into a hotel in Vernon to spare the family his moods, or stayed in his bedroom for days without coming out. This period was also marked by tragedy. Several of the Impressionists died between 1894 and 1906, including Morisot, Pissarro, Sisley, Cezanne, Caillebotte, and also Manet. Surely, when faced with his own mortality, Monet became even more obsessed about painting something superb and lasting. He was most heartbroken by the death of his stepdaughter, Cezanne. Monet wrote, "So much pain and heartache, and yet I must be strong and console my loved ones." As I mentioned, Cezanne left 2 children, with her widower, Theodore Butler, who the following year married her sister Martha to take care of the kids. By the beginning of the 20th century, Monet's paintings were the highlight of many exhibitions, and he sought inspiration abroad, in London, where he painted Waterloo Bridge more than 40 times, as well as other subjects. Incidentally, he finished the London canvases at his studio back in Giverny using photographs for reference. Despite the myths, he didn't only paint outdoors, didn't finish his canvases in one sitting, and he did sometimes use photographs for reference. Let's talk about a few of Monet's distinctive painting techniques. He used varied brush strokes, smudges, streaks, dabs, thick or thin, longer or shorter. He blended paint wet on wet, and he layered wet on dry. In 1904, Monet's total income was 271,000 francs, and he spent much of that on maintenance, design changes, greenhouses, the gardening staff, maids, cooks, and a chauffeur. When Monet had money, he spent it. He was quite proud of his grounds, saying, "My garden is my most beautiful masterpiece." From time to time, Monet allowed art buyers and journalists to tour the estate in his studio. He told one writer who was visiting, "Gardening and painting apart, I'm no good at anything." As magnificent as the gardens were, the water lily pond was born of inspiration. As I explained, in 1893 he bought the adjacent land across the railway tracks, and he received permission to divert a stream to create the pond. He ordered the first water lilies in 1894 from a botanist who, through crossbreeding, created the first viable colored water lilies in Europe. At first he painted the water lilies like still life flowers. This is one of 8 paintings from his initial attempts to capture a subject that he would pursue for the rest of his life. It sold at auction last month for about $30 million. Given its historic value, I'm surprised that this small canvas didn't fetch a higher bid, but the market for Impressionism has cooled off in recent years. He soon abandoned the close-ups of water lilies and began a series of the pond and Japanese bridge he had constructed, which was reminiscent of the hokusai prints that he collected. When he returned to focusing on the lilies, he transformed the world of landscape painting. By taking away the bridge and just looking at the water, he eliminated the horizon line, a standard feature of virtually every landscape ever painted before then. Like the Morning on the Seine pictures, Monet wanted to capture the reflections of trees and skies in constantly changing lighting. But he also wanted to represent the subterranean world and depict the lily pads as almost floating like clouds. No painting had ever been so maddening, and he had severe self-doubt about being able to achieve what he was trying to do. With all of their children now adults, and the house and garden being tended to, Monet and Elise took a rare trip together in 1908 when they spent 2.5 months in Venice. She attended to his needs and visited friends, and he searched for locations to paint. Elise also saw how the changing light from day to day drove Monet from spirit and enthusiasm to grumbling. She wrote to their son Jean-Pierre that she better understood what Monet had been complaining about on all of those painting trips he'd taken. The trip took a lot out of her, and when they returned to Giverny, he had 38 paintings in progress, and she was ill and bedridden. Art dealers rushed to see the pictures, and to Durand-Ruel's regret, Monet offered the first batch to the Bernheim Gallery. However, he said they wouldn't receive the pictures until they were reworked in the studio. After returning from Venice, Monet looked anew at the water lilies he had wrestled with and recognized their merit. For these, he gave Durand-Ruel the rights to a solo exhibition to be held in 1909. Despite the torture he endured in their creation and his anguish that the exhibit would be a disaster, it turned out to be perhaps his greatest critical and commercial success. There were 48 of these magical waterscapes, and his struggles turned into triumphs. These pictures typically had at least a dozen layers, some of which he scraped off while wet, which added texture and enhanced subsequent layers. This resulted in shimmering, masterful brush strokes. Close examination reveals a kaleidoscopic array of colors and textures. What's more, critics praised the upside-down paintings and called them a mirror without a frame. They recognized the innovation of the avant-garde abstraction in these decorative compositions, and one reviewer exclaimed that no one had ever painted like this before. The exhibit was an unqualified success. By having all of these waterscapes on the walls, the gallery felt like a flowery aquarium, and 5 different journalists pleaded for a millionaire to buy the entire suite and keep them together. Sadly, the height of his acclaim was followed by misery in 1911, when after years of suffering, Elise died from leukemia. Ever since Cezanne's death a decade earlier, Elise had been seriously depressed and anxious. Certainly Monet's moods didn't help to calm her. She was 65 years old and had lost the vitality that held the family and household together. Now, feeling utterly alone, Monet was supported by nearby family members and friends. Here he is in that general time period with stepdaughters Germaine and Martha, granddaughter Lily Butler, and one of Paul Durand-Ruel's sons, who were partners in their father's business. Monet stayed in regular contact with several friends. One was Gustave Geffroy, a journalist, art critic, and author who wrote the first biography of Monet. Even closer was the widely acclaimed French writer Octave Mirbeau, whose novels have been translated into 30 languages. Clearly, Monet favored intellectuals who were high-achieving, celebrated figures like himself. He also enjoyed a younger couple, Sacha Guitry and his wife Charlotte, who were devoted to him. They were both actors, and Guitry was also a playwright, director, and filmmaker. His first film was made in 1914, and it showed Monet painting in his garden, as well as short segments on Renoir, Rodin, Sarah Bernhardt, and others. It's easily found on the internet by searching for "Film of Monet Painting in the Garden." In 1913, knowing that Monet was unwilling to paint, Les Guitry, as he called them, coaxed him to their country home to redesign the gardens. They enticed him by sending luxurious automobiles to collect him and plied him with lobster and champagne. Charlotte wrote him affectionate letters calling him her dear and great gardener, and he also wrote to Blanche, "Life here is always delicious." However, his most encouraging support came from his longtime friend, Georges Clemenceau, an influential journalist and politician whose first term as the Prime Minister of France had ended a couple of years earlier. They'd met in their 20s, and Clemenceau sought out Monet when he saw the Rouen Cathedral pictures in the mid-1890s. Clemenceau visited Giverny often, and they shared a love of conversation, fine wine, food, art, liberal politics, and philosophy. He pushed Monet to begin painting again, and 6 months after Elise died, Monet agreed to finish a few of the Venice pictures. Wrought with sadness, bringing back the memory of the vacation in Venice did little to lift his spirits. Monet wrote, I am completely fed up with painting, and I am going to pack up my brushes and colors for good. He felt defeated and destroyed paintings that were unsatisfactory. However, eventually he finished enough pictures and invited Bernheim and Durand-Ruel to come and see them. All of the Venice paintings were dated 1908, a remembrance of happier times. Slowly, Monet began once again painting his gardens and lily pond. However, his inertia slowed him down and made him feel like he had already accomplished everything he could. He wrote to one dealer, "I wanted to believe that I would make headway and finally do something worthwhile, but alas, I must now bury that hope." On one visit to Giverny that year, 1913, after the customary garden tour and scrumptious lunch, Monet took Clemenceau into the cellar. There, in the dank gloom, were the first water lily pictures from 1897. With great enthusiasm, Clemenceau said he found them amazing. He actually later confessed that they were pretty but sober and not very interesting. But he didn't say that to Monet, and instead reminded him of his idea from long ago of painting many large canvases of the lily pond to fill entire rooms. A few days later, Monet wrote to Geoffroy that he was, quote, in good shape and intended to undertake great things. Again, Monet was ready to tackle the impossible and begin his grand décoration. By 1913, only he and Renoir were still painting, and as I mentioned, Renoir did so while suffering from debilitating arthritis. Degas had become reclusive, morose, and depressed as he had become blind, saying, "Death is all I think of," until it became his reality in 1917. Likewise, Marie Cassatt was virtually blind and had quit painting in 1904. Unfortunately, Monet was likewise having vision problems that would plague him for the rest of his life, but he could still paint. There were various pairs of glasses with special lenses, cataract surgeries, periods of color blindness, eye drops, and on and off refusals to get treatment. At one point, it got so severe that he couldn't see the difference between colors, but he relied on knowing where they were on his palette and what they'd look like when mixed. Oftentimes, the results were unsatisfactory, and he destroyed the canvases. You can understand why. He feared that after he died, wretched pieces would get sold in his name, and he did not want his failures to survive. That seems reasonable, even if he sometimes took it to extremes. After 10 years of nagging, Clemenceau said, "Your work gives poor results, and therefore you can whine about that instead of getting surgery, because complaining gives you the greatest joy of your life." Eventually, Monet relented to cataract surgery in 1923, which combined with new glasses brought positive results. But backing up to February of 1914, Monet's oldest son, John, died after several years of illness. The saving grace then returned to Giverny. Jean's widow and stepsister, Blanche, went from taking care of her husband to being her stepfather's steadfast companion. Clemenceau called her Monet's blue angel. Even with his chronic vision problems, Monet remained steadfast in his desire to create his grand décoration. To accommodate his grandiose plan, in 1914, he spent 50,000 francs to build an immense third studio on a parcel of the property that he had purchased from a neighbor. The studio rose to a height of nearly 50 feet and had huge skylights with shades and pulleys to adjust the light. He needed so much space because he envisioned multi-paneled paintings that would be more than 6 feet high and as much as 42 feet wide. The paintings rested on casters and would be rolled around per his needs. Plus, there would be his studies, most of which were about 4 to 6.5 feet tall and 6 to 8 feet wide. He would end up painting hundreds of these from the age of 75 and for the next decade. This was an enormous task, unimaginable in scope, and he could not possibly have done it all without help. As you recall, Blanche was Monet's assistant when she was young. Now, having returned to Giverny around the age of 50, in addition to providing emotional support and running the household, Blanche assisted with his work. She would have wrestled with his canvases or arranged with workers to move them as he wished. She would have set up his stool and easel, put out his paints, and perhaps even prepared his palette. Although Clemenceau said that she worked on his canvases and often took on the monotonous task of applying primer, Blanche adamantly denied ever painting on his canvases, saying it would have been a sacrilege. But back to the construction of the massive third studio. Despite delays because of lumber supplies were needed for the Western Front during the beginning of World War I, Monet was working away at his large sketches of the lily pond. However, as the war continued, Monet became predictably depressed. More than 30 men from Giverny enlisted, including Jean-Pierre and most of his gardeners. Michel drove an ambulance at the front. A hospital was set up in a converted 17th century monastery, and Monet contributed vegetables to the wounded and shell-shocked soldiers. The artist colony dissolved, and all of the foreigners went home, including Theodore Butler taking Martha and their daughters to New York. Still, he continued painting his water lilies and gardens. Although they were distressed with many of the gardeners leaving to fight, he wrote to Durand-Ruel's son Joseph, "We are well and continue to receive good news about our loved ones, but we live in constant anguish and worry." He also joined with other artists and writers to create their own publication in support of France's war effort. He told the publisher, "If you think my name can be of some help in the work that you're doing, feel free to make use of it." Plus, he donated many paintings to various auctions and did a series of weeping willows to symbolize the war widows and raise funds for their cause. In this series, the trees represent the weeping widows and darkness and despair felt by everyone in France. Giverny was about 60 miles from the Western Front, and while Monet painted in his peaceful garden, he could hear explosions in the distance. Michel and Jean-Pierre were much closer to the action and both suffered from what we would now call PTSD. Here they are in uniform visiting on leave. Monet never finished paintings of himself and only tried a couple of times, once in 1886, which I showed earlier, and this one in 1917. He'd made 2 attempts that he destroyed, but Clemenceau was able to rescue this version. By November of that year, 1917, Clemenceau was once again the Prime Minister of France and was also Minister of War. Still, he found time to visit Monet. Another of Monet's friends was Etienne Clementel, a minor painter who served as Minister of Commerce during the war. Clementel helped Monet to get canvases, art supplies, and good wine delivered on trains, taking soldiers and supplies to the front. Also, Charlotte sent cartons of his favorite cigarettes, which were hard to come by. So he worried about his loved ones and struggled with his large grand etudes, the studies. At least he was comfortable. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed to end the fighting of World War I. Exactly 1 week later, after peace was declared, Clemenceau had lunch in Giverny, and Monet wrote, "It was his first day off, and I'm the one he came to visit, which makes me very proud." Soon after, Clemenceau and Geoffroy paid Monet a visit and discussed the Grand Decoration, and that Monet wanted to donate some of the etudes to the state in honor of the victory. They talked about Rodin, who willed his home and art studio to the state when he died the previous year. He also gave them the right to make casts from his original plasters. It was a big deal, and Monet wanted something similar for his Grand Decoration. As the years ticked by, Monet continued work on his final murals. All the canvases were 200 centimeters high, about 6.5 feet, and 425 centimeters wide, about 14 feet, and most of the compositions had from 2 to 4 panels. Green Reflections has 2 panels and is nearly 28 feet wide, and Morning has 4 panels and is almost 42 feet wide. These are indeed grand, and they would require a special place to be displayed. While Monet and Clemenceau argued over how many panels would be donated and where they would be housed, the painter was also creating works to be sold. In addition to some of the etudes that he made available, he also painted more garden scenes, some of which he viewed favorably, and others he ordered Blanche to destroy. Besides himself, she was the only other person he trusted with that task. In 1920, Monet turned 80, and he used every ounce of energy on what he called the work. He was like a man possessed. After meetings with various people, the negotiations were concluded, and on October 14th, the Petit Parisien newspaper announced on the front page, the painter Claude Monet donates 12 of his finest landscapes to the state. However, that number and the final location were subject to change. One renowned architect designed a circular building that was highly regarded by the French authorities, but Monet disapproved. Another proposal was to reconfigure l'Orangerie, a former greenhouse in the west corner of the Tuileries Garden in Paris. It included 2 large oval rooms and was near the Louvre, among other important sites. They proposed it to Monet, and he surprisingly agreed. The gallery was set, and Clemenceau wanted the paintings delivered while Monet could still be alive to see it. However, the painter was insufferable. He insisted that he had to continue improving the paintings, but in some places they were probably overworked. But I think the project was keeping Monet alive. At some point, Monet insisted that he would make the donation after all, but that it might have to be done posthumously. He told Clemenceau, "When I am dead, I shall find their imperfections more bearable." And that is indeed what happened. Although he was not told, a radiological exam revealed lung cancer. On December 5th, 1926, Monet was surrounded by Impressionist paintings of his admired companions, as well as his son Michel, Blanche, and Clemenceau, who took his friend's hand and asked, "Are you in pain?" "No," Monet faintly replied, and then passed away. 2 weeks after Monet's funeral, 8 compositions comprised of 22 enormous panels, a full football field in length, were transported to Paris. On May 17, 1927, the Museum at l'Orangerie was opened as the Musée Claude Monet. He had intended these panoramic views to surround the viewer in a quiet, meditative space. For me, visiting these galleries was like going to a most sacred place. I would sit and take in the immense project, and I also looked at them from inches away. Monet has had a tremendous impact on my personal aesthetic and inspired my growth as a painter, and for that I am extremely grateful.